Financial rights are one of the much debated topics between the British Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Brunei, Sarawak and North Borneo during the formation of Malaysia. Take for example, the major issue in the negotiations between Brunei and Federation of Malaya aside from the Brunei's revenues, especially from oil, was the attempt of the imposition of the new federal government's right to Brunei taxation. Notwithstanding Bruneian protests, the Tunku issued an ultimatum containing Kuala Lumpur's final offer which ultimately caused His Highness Sultan of Brunei to withdraw from the negotiations for the inclusion of Brunei into the new Federation of Malaysia. Such outcome gives us a picture on how serious the issue was regarding the rights on taxation, as the Sultan of Brunei was not very keen on integration at the present time because of his fear that Malaya would use Brunei as a milch cow. North Borneo and Sarawak position is no less different regarding the financial rights of the Borneo territories. The Lansdowne Committee report, ICG report, disclosed that in early December 1962 a deadlock also seemed to have been reached on financial issues. The representatives of North Borneo demanded that the state should retain control of its own finance, development and tariff, and should have the rights to work up its own taxation and to raise loans on its own credit. Sarawak, however, had accepted that taxes and tariffs must be federal matters, but had secured Malayan acceptance of a formula which should enable the state to meet its current expenditures and provide for steady growth in these. The formula called Annual Balancing Grant and Escalating Grant has been expressed in financial provisions, paragraph 24(6) and paragraph 24(7) of the IGC report. Paragraph 24(6) expressed that, subject to the provisions for review made in sub-paragraph 9 below, in order that the Borneo state governments should have enough revenue to meet the cost of state services, the state should receive as of right, where the assignment of revenues to the state would in 1963 have resulted in a deficit, an annual balancing grant equal to the difference between the estimated state revenue in 1963, including assigned revenue and statutory grants, and the estimated cost of state services in 1963, calculated as if the proposed constitutional arrangements had already come into force. The published revenue and expenditure estimates for 1963 would be used as the basis of the calculations. Paragraph 24(7) expressed that, subject to the provisions for review made in sub-paragraph 9 below, in addition to the annual balancing grant, Sarawak should receive as of right revenue sufficient to meet the annual increase in the current costs of state services plus any sum required to offset any decrease in the state's revenue. During the first 10 years this would take the form of an escalating annual grant. The amount of this grant would be fixed in advance for each of the first 5 years and would be decided at the end of this period by an independent assessor as described in sub-paragraph 9. In recognition of the fact that the Sarawak state departments are still relatively undeveloped compared with their Malayan equivalents and because otherwise there would be no means of enabling them to develop to an acceptable level, the escalating annual grant together with the natural growth in state revenue and revenue assigned will, until the first independent review, assure an expansion of state services of not less than 10% per annum provided examination of expenditure over the period 1959 to 1962 shows a rate of expansion in such services of not less than that rate. If the average percentage growth over the period 1959 to 1962 proves to be less than 10% per annum, then the escalating annual grant shall be calculated so as to provide for a continued expansion at the same rate. Despite strong opposition from the Borneo bloc, Mr. Tan Soo Sin, the representative of the Malayan on the Financial Subcommittee, seems to have been convinced that the British would compel the territories to accept the agreement over the financial rights based on the Malayan counter-proposal and so saw no reason to compromise. With the help of a British promise of £1,500,000 a year for 5 years for development in the territories, which had been held back earlier by the British to be used in case it should be needed to resolve just such a deadlock, agreement was reached on the basis of Malayan counter-proposals, which assigned additional items of revenue to the territories. These included the assignment to Sabah and Sarawak on the rights over the state sales taxes. Only then, the financial rights were delegated for the federal government. Such limited taxing powers of the federal government over the Borneo territories was actually being accepted by the Malayan government on the British government's advice.